Hello and welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their current or recent research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it is my great pleasure to be here in Vienna and meeting with Karel Pacovsky to hear about his research into the nuns of Prague Castle, who he claims were noble and lazy. Karel defended his PhD in medieval Latin studies in Prague in 2023. Currently, he is working as a researcher and lecturer at Charles University in Prague and as a high school teacher in Prague. His research focuses on the history of Christianity in the medieval and early modern periods, especially female monasticism and the Bohemian Reformation. In his free time, he is studying for a graduate degree in Protestant theology. And when he's not working or studying, he enjoys discovering new places, biking and playing badminton. Karel, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
It's a great pleasure. Now, you selected the title for this podcast of Noble and Lazy, the Nuns of Prague Castle. So my first question has to be, were they noble? And was becoming a nun at St George's Monastery in the Prague Castle, was it a mark of status?
Yes, thank you for this question. In the title, I used this noble and lazy with a question mark because it's what the people usually think about these nuns. If you read the literature, you will read that the nuns came from the most noble Czech families, that they were often princesses, and that they lived a very comfortable life there, almost like in a palace. But when I look closer at the preserved sources, we can see that it's probably rather a myth that's spreading around these nuns. The preserved sources that we can have are rather preserved from the late 13th century, so that we can really see the background of the nuns. And in that time, in the, let's say, 14th, 15th, 16th century, not many of the nuns came from the highest nobility. It was maybe 1/3 of the nuns. And abbesses or nuns of royal descent were already exceptional in that time. So maybe most of the nuns came from lower nobility, and maybe 1/3 of the nuns came even just from the cities, from the richest families in the cities, but still they were just daughters of townmen.
So was being a nun there a mark of some social status?
Sure, it was. So you could not be just a daughter of a peasant to enter this monastery. You had to be rich enough to get a place there. And you had to be personally free to be accepted there. So you couldn't be a subject. You know, you had to be either really noble or a citizen.
Did they have to pay a dowry to become a nun?
Yeah, very likely. Yeah, or to bring some estates to the convent that would accept them. Yeah.
So poor peasants like me could never have made it.
Yeah, and it was actually criticized. One of the confessors of the abbey in the early 15th century criticized this practice that a nice, pious woman who would like to join the convent and to live the religious life is not accepted because she's not rich enough. But a nobleman who is, noble woman who is very proud and is not that interesting in the religious life, but the family just wants to have her in the convent, is accepted with joy because she brings a lot of money to the community.
Yes. So what was the advantages to a young woman of entering this monastery? And typically at what age did the young women become nuns?
Yeah, it seems that the women came to the monastery quite early. They were sent by their families to the convent for education already, and it could happen really when they were 5 years old, 6 years old, the confessor criticized the practice that the young girls get the religious habit already at the age of 7 years, which is quite early. So we can see that the monastery operated somehow also as a school for young girls, but probably mostly for those girls who were planned to stay there for their whole life. It was not that easy to learn all the necessary stuff for a life in a convent. You were supposed to learn Latin, to learn the liturgy, and it took time. Therefore, it seems that it was not that usual that an adult would be accepted as a member of the community. So mostly the nuns were really educated there since their childhood and stayed in the community.
Yeah.
And the advantages, I think, for women who wanted to live kind of intellectual life in the Middle Ages, it was the place, because no other women had such access to the books like the nuns, for example. So if you didn't strive for having a family, but you would rather really pray and read, it was a place where you could enjoy that style of life.
Yeah, but they were sent to the nunnery at the age of 5, 6 or 7. When did they take their vows?
It's also a good question, but we don't know, or I didn't find any record about it in the sources, but I suppose that the vows were taken not even when they were adult in our today's perspective. So it could be around 10, 12, 14 years old. So it could be quite early. And a special role in the education of such young girls played their aunts or their relatives, because usually a young girl came to the monastery already knowing that there is her aunt, or maybe that the aunts themselves asked the other relatives to send a young niece to the monastery so that she can have a young relative there, maybe somehow compensating her a daughter.
Yes, that would be nice to have someone to be family.
But then also what we know from the confessor of the early 15th century, many of the girls, when they were raised up there, they didn't like the idea to being there, and they complained about their aunts that they entered the monastery just because of them, and that was not their own choice.
Yeah, I can see that complaint. Women didn't have much choice. Based on your sources, what was the daily life of the nuns? Actually, what I really want to ask, were they lazy? And were they lazy within the context of their class and the time?
I said they were lazy, just with a question mark. Were they lazy? It's what their confessor suggests. It's actually the critique by the confessor of the early 15th century, which is, by the way, a very great source we have. It's a book that he wrote for the nuns. And there is really a lot of critique of the nuns. So he criticized them for not keeping the rule of St Benedict that seriously as they should. He criticized them that they don't like to wake up very early in the morning together for the prayers. He criticizes them that they keep contacts with people outside the monastery and so on. So if we read these moralistic writings, we get the feeling they were lazy. But if you read it more carefully, you see that they really lived a monastic life, that it was not just lazy life full of free time, but that they really kept all the prayers they should have kept. So they met 7 times a day in the church for common liturgy of the hours, and 1 time during the night. Although what the monk criticizes, this confessor, they often didn't pray really at the midnight as they should, but they prayed this night prayer already before going to sleep, so that they don't have to wake up really during the night.
That sounds a very pragmatic solution to me.
Mm-hmm. But it was very usual. It was really usual solution in many other monasteries as well.
Yeah. Pray in advance, pray in arrears. Yeah, I can cope with that.
Yeah, so we cannot say that they were more lazy than the other monks or nuns in that time. That's definitely not true.
No, I'm sure God doesn't have a clock. You've been talking about the confessor, and what little I know of religion, they didn't have women confessors. So was the St George's Monastery exclusively female?
Yeah, the monastery itself was exclusively female. So there was a group of nuns led by their abbess. Around the year 1400, just before the Hussite Wars, we know that there were about 40 professed nuns in the convent, plus maybe 10 young girls educated in the convent, so about 50 women lived there together. But of course, as you said, in the church, especially medieval church, you need also male clergy to perform the mass for the nuns, to serve, to administer the sacraments, because they can be administered only by men. So although, as you mentioned, the sacrament of confession, it seems that until the 13th century it was even possible for abbesses to confess her own nuns. But then the canon law changed so that this could have been done only by the priests. But in the period we are speaking about now, the later Middle Ages, these were certainly only the priests who could confess the nuns. So at St George's Monastery, there was also a group of clergy, priests, deacons and subdeacons, who took pastoral care of the nuns and who also celebrated the church services daily. Originally, they also confessed the nuns, but it changed during the 14th century because Prague Archbishop forced the nuns not to choose their confessors from this group of their own clergy, which was subject to the nuns actually, but he called a Benedictine monk to confess the nuns.
I read your papers, which I really enjoyed. You've written about one specific nun, Sister Elshka of St George's. How do you know about her and her specifically?
So Elshka was a nun living in St. George's Convent at the beginning of the 15th century. We know about her from a list of the nuns from 1401, and also we know that she still lived in 1407, but it's just a name in a list of nuns. What makes her really an interesting person is her book that has been preserved. And this book was written by a confessor of the nuns who was called Martin, and he came from Ostrov Abbey. It's a Benedictine Abbey south of Prague. And this confessor decided to write a book for this specific nun, for Elshka. We don't know why. We don't know if it was her wish or if just he decided to write her a book as a present. We don't know. But this book is very nice because it's a very educative book. It contains the rule of St Benedict changed to the feminine gender so that the nuns can really read it very personally as the text written for them. And it has also an extensive commentary in the margins. And from these comments, which are mostly taken from some other older commentaries, but sometimes they were really written by this specific monk, Martin, to Elžka, we can read more, or we can discover more about the details of Elžka's life and also of the life of the other nuns at St. George's Monastery in the early 15th century.
Wow. Was Martin the confessor you were talking about?
Yes, it's him.
Okay. And did he travel regularly from Ostrov to Prague Castle for their confessions?
I think so.
Is it far?
Not that far, so I think you can do it in one day, there and back.
I was actually just wondering where the 50 women had their confessor and their priests. Were the men attached to a monastery, a male monastery, or did they live in the female monastery?
Yeah, so this monk who was a confessor, he lived in his own monastery in Ostrov. I have no idea if he could just also sleep somewhere in Prague, maybe yes. But concerning the clergy of the church, these were just priests and deacons and subdeacons who were called canons. They were kind of secular canons. They lived at their own houses in Prague. They just met in the church for the liturgy.
So it was more like a parish priest who just turned up, did the liturgy and went home for supper.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Or sometimes they had the suppers even together somewhere at the church or near the church, because for all their duties that they fulfilled in the church, they had to be paid, and sometimes a reward for their work was also that they got some meal from the abbess of the monastery, who was actually in charge of them. There were 5 priests, 2 deacons, 2 subdeacons, altogether 9 clergymen, but they didn't have their own boss. They were directly subordinate to the abbess, who was the head of not only the community of the nuns, but also of this community of the clergymen. But this was not really appreciated by the men, that they are led by a woman. And one of the canons of St. George, who wrote a memorial book of the canons of the church, cannot explain how this could happen, that men are ruled by a woman. And he said this was very likely the punishment of God for their laziness, that the original priests at the church were too lazy, and therefore God punished them, that the nuns came to the church and they took the rule over the church and even over the priest.
Oh, poor men.
So he warns the other canons not to neglect their duties, otherwise something even worse could happen to them than the women ruling over them.
Oh, I love it. It must have actually been quite a shock to have a job and realise your boss is a woman.
It was not that usual in that time.
But surely there were many female monasteries, and it would have been the same situation everywhere in the female monasteries.
I think in the Bohemian context, this was really unusual. Usually the female monasteries were subordinate to some other male monasteries, so it was actually the other way, that the abbess or the prioress was subordinate to an abbot of a nearby male monastery. But what we know about St. George's Monastery, they always kept their independence. So even in the 1330s, the Benedictine Abbot of Břevnov Abbey, which was the most important Benedictine Abbey in Bohemia, very close to Prague Castle actually, tried to subordinate the abbess of St. George and the community under his control. But the nuns defended themselves. They complained to the Pope, and they were successful. So they kept their independence from other Benedictine monasteries in Bohemia.
But the abbess would have been a highly educated woman and presumably of reasonably high nobility. So it would have been natural for her to have authority. And I guess the clergy were less educated and of a lower social status. So it would have been more normal, would it?
Your question raises more questions because, sure, they were very educated, and especially in the oldest times of the monastery, we know from Cosmas of Prague, chronicler in the 12th century, that the abbesses were very eloquent, very well educated in Latin, and they were really partners of the bishops of Prague in the political negotiations towards the Duke of Bohemia. And of course, this was the first monastic institution in Bohemia, founded around 970. So I think in that time it played a very important role.
And it was originally for women?
And it was originally for women.
Wow.
Which is kind of surprising for us, because if you look at it from the perspective of post-Tridentine Catholicism, this doesn't really make sense, because usually the female convents are perceived as burdens for the male clergy, that they have to take care of them and to administer the sacraments to them. But here we can see that in the newly Christianized country, the very first monastic institution is female. So I think we should not think that this institution was just an enclosed space just for some women who just prayed there and they just needed the man coming there to administer sacraments. I think in this 10th, 11th century, they really had to play a crucial role in supporting the Christianization of Bohemia.
That's interesting. So did they go out and preach?
Yes, from the Chronicle of Cosmas of Prague, we see that the abbesses sometimes left the monastery. And what he writes about their eloquency, it seems that they were really used to speak in the public. And they knew Latin very well. So I would say they could even preach. And they could educate not maybe only the future nuns, but maybe even the future clergymen in Bohemia.
Was their working language Czech or Latin? Particularly if they're going out and training future clergymen.
I think when they educated somebody, they educated them really in the monastery. But this was the first community, this first stable community in Bohemia that performed Latin liturgy all the day and night. So they were really good at Latin. How they spoke together, we don't know. We can guess first around the year 1400, but in that time we can see that the community was predominantly Czech-speaking. But there were certain times during the day, especially in the night, when they were forbidden to speak by the rule of St Benedict. They just spoke together in Latin, thinking that that's not that a big sin if you speak in Latin.
Was it normal to have specific roles for the nuns? Did they also have servants?
So you had almost 50 nuns there, so each of them had a different duty. We know also from the confessor Martin from the early 15th century that Elshka was a librarian in the convent, or she should take care of the books of the monastery. We know this because he criticized her that she was not doing it properly, that she doesn't even have a list of all the books of the monastery, which she should have. But we can also see that his critique was not very successful because there is no catalogue of the book of the convent until the dissolution of the monastery in 1782. But if I may just add with Elžka and Elžka's role in the convent, she was not only a librarian, but what we can see also from the manuscript that was dedicated to her, she was very likely also responsible for the education of the future nuns in the convent. And that's maybe the reason why Martin wrote her this book, because it's really a rule of St Benedict with a commentary that she could very easily use during her teachings for the nuns, with very nice examples, quotes from the Bible, examples from the daily life, how they should not do it, how they should do it, etc.
So it was a really good guide for Elžka and her colleagues, and a wonderful source for you.
Yes, and we can see that she was quite strict teacher, because Martin wrote her, if you punish the young girl Margareta, if you beat her, then please give her at least something to eat. Poor girls.
Yeah, poor girl. Yeah. I think in that same paper you also said that the nuns were expected to read at least one book a year. Was their time so constrained that they couldn't read more, or were the books so hard to read?
I think this is just the precept of the rule of St Benedict. So that's actually what St Benedict in the 6th century wrote to his monks, that every monk has the duty to read at least one book a year, always during the time of Lent. So we know that this precept was really kept at St George's convent, because always at the beginning of this Lent period, the librarian distributed the books the nuns should read for the next year, and she collected the read books from the last year. And of course, we can see that the language of the books was Latin.
Yes.
So we cannot imagine that they were somehow less educated, stupid. Their Latin had to be really good, maybe better than Latin of regular priests, surely better than Latin of priests in the countryside, I would say.
Yes, I'm sure it would, because they're communicating in Latin, they're having 7 services a day in Latin, but presumably that's quite repetitive.
Yeah, it's very repetitive. It's mostly the Psalms, so 7 times a day, 1 time during the night. So it's also very demanding for singing, because most of these texts you should not just read, but also sing. It can be really demanding, as we can also read from the book written by the confessor, who says that especially during the feast day, when a lot of people, crowds are coming to the church and listen to the liturgy, that you should pick up good singers, not the bad singers, so that the people don't laugh.
So St George's Church, it was a place of public worship as well?
Yes. So St George's Church was even a ducal burial place. So in the early Middle Ages, the Dukes of Bohemia were buried there. There was even an important grave of Saint Ludmila, the first female saint of Bohemia, the grandmother of Saint Wenceslas, the main patron saint of Bohemia. So it was also for the public, it was quite an important church, and also pilgrims were coming there because of the grave of Saint Ludmila. And if you look at the church, there was the main nave in the middle that was used by the lay people. Then in the eastern part of the church, there was the presbytery for the priests with the choir of the canons of St. George, who met there for their daily prayers, and they celebrated the Mass there at the eastern main altar. But in the western part of the church, there was the choir of the nuns, who prayed there daily. So maybe even sometimes, especially during some feast days, you could hear kind of a concert of the male voices from the eastern side of the church that were then mixed with the female voices from the western side of the church.
And put those two services together to get that amazing stereo effect.
Yeah, and sometimes the nuns even left their female part, their female choir, and went to the presbytery, and they performed the liturgy together with the priests. This is especially the Easter Sunday. In the morning, they performed a liturgical play. So the nuns, they represented the women who were looking for Jesus in the grave, and at the grave there, the angels were sitting. So these were some of the clergymen of St. George who were playing the angels. And then there was even the scene of Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus, and Jesus was performed by a priest of the church, and Mary Magdalene, one of the nuns. So it could be also an amazing part of the life of the convent.
Oh, that must have been really moving. Beautiful. For my final question, from what you've said, St. George's Monastery was very closely related with nobility, with status, with the foundations of the church within Bohemia. And you also say that the abbess of the monastery was directly involved in the coronations of the queens. How did this happen? What was her role? Tell me, explain some more.
Yeah, so this is also something very special about St. George's Monastery, that the abbess of the convent, she just played an important role in the coronations of the queens of Bohemia. The coronations of the queens, as well as the coronations of the kings, took place in St. Vitus Cathedral, in Prague Cathedral, which is just next to the convent of St. George, in Prague Castle, in the ducal, later royal and imperial residence of Prague. The beginnings of this tradition that the abbesses took place in the coronation are quite hidden. But you can imagine that the abbess was one of the main representatives of the church in Bohemia. So, for example, in the 11th century, in the area of later historic Prague, there was just St. Vitus Cathedral with its chapter, the St. George's Abbey, and then the Vyšehrad chapter at the other side of the river. So I think if there was a big coronation mass, as just big liturgical occasion to meet there in the cathedral church, the abbess was invited as well. And then later in the 13th and early 14th century, the abbesses of St. George's were often royal daughters. There was the abbess Agnes in the early 13th century. There was the abbess Kunigunde in the early 14th century. And they were very close relatives of the future queens. And as we know, the relatives of the queen were very often playing an important role during the coronations. They were helping with the clothing of the future queen and so on. So I think we should see the beginnings of this tradition not only in the prominent location of the abbey, but also in these very close contacts with the royal family.
What did the abbess do in the coronation? What was her role?
Yeah, actually the role of the abbess was really prominent. In the early modern times, the abbess even took the crown of St. Wenceslas, and together with the Archbishop of Prague and the Supreme Burgrave of the kingdom, the highest representative of the king, they placed the crown on the head of the queen. So she was the only woman in Europe in that time that could crown during the coronations. So this tradition took place until the dissolution of the abbey in 1782, but it continued because the privilege was transferred on another institution of noble ladies until the 19th century, when there was the last coronation of the Queen of Bohemia. And there was a myth that this tradition was introduced, of crowning the queens, was introduced by the most famous Czech medieval king, Charles IV, who also became Holy Roman Emperor. But I discovered that that was not really true, that it's rather a nice story from the 17th, 18th century, but it's not supported by the sources. So the role of the abbesses in the medieval times was not that prominent yet.
So was it normal before Charles or after?
So Charles IV was a very important figure for the coronations in Bohemia because he wrote a new coronation order. We don't know really the details about the coronations before him, therefore. We guess, the abbess took part in the coronation, and what we can read in the coronation order of Charles IV, we know that the abbey's main role was to accompany the queen. From some later sources, we know that she helped somehow with the anointment, with the holy oil. A woman was needed to assist with this, to help to open the clothes and so on. But the biggest change in her role, I think, were the Hussite Wars.
Really? I suppose so, yes.
Yes, because during the Hussite Wars, there was no archbishop in Prague. And also, suffragan bishopric in Litomyšl disappeared. So there were not enough bishops in Bohemia. And when a queen came to Prague to be crowned, mostly together with the king, she needed to take bishops from abroad to help with the coronations. But there were not as many bishops who are willing to take part in this long journey to the kingdom of the heretics, of the Hussites. And I think the abbess replaced the assistant bishops in some of the roles, even with assisting with the insignia, with the crown. And after the Hussite Wars in the 15th century, the abbess took this prominent role during the ceremony, which she then kept even when the Archbishopric of Prague was renewed in Bohemia.
Well, I'd never realised that a Hussite war could effectively influence the status of an abbess.
Yeah.
You would just never think about that. Those weird connections. I love history.
Yeah, me too.
And on that cheerful note, Karel, I'm afraid we must leave it there. Thank you so much for coming in to talk about your noble and possibly lazy nuns of St. George's in Prague.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here, even in these hot days.
Today I've been talking to Karel Pacovsky about his research into Noble and Lazy, the Nuns of Prague Castle. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting, enjoyable as I did. And I certainly did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which MECERN members and associates talk about their recent or current research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you would like to talk about it to MECERN, please do contact me through the MECERN board or MECERN website administrator. I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.